Come on, we're all waiting. Well, I hope you're enjoying this weather because frankly, I am not. And my dog doesn't enjoy it either. I'm like, it's not even raining and he doesn't even want to go outside, which means he's going to be full of all sorts of energy. All right, so if we open up the syllabus, so for those of you that are zooming in, this is going to be relevant for you too. So you'll kind of notice that on Friday, we have a homework assignment due. On Wednesday, I'm going to tell you a spooky story called The War of the Ghosts. So you're going to hear about this on Wednesday. And then what I'd like you to do, I don't want you to do it right away. I want you to at least wait until Wednesday evening or on a Thursday. What I'd like you to do is try to remember as many details from the story that you can. So if you know ahead of time that you're not going to be here on Wednesday, please make sure that you watch the recording of the video so that you can actually hear the story, because we're going to start talking about everyday memory on Wednesday, and that will include talking about memories for stories and things like that. So on Wednesday, I'll tell you a story. On Friday, I'd like you to either email or write out your remembering that story in class. And yes, because this is a scary story, I am going to turn off all the lights while I tell it and put a flashlight under my face. So I asked permission to use the good flashlight, y'all. Like, this is serious. So if you know you're not going to be here on Wednesday, make sure that you watch the live stream so that you can turn in homework on Friday. All right, so the last time that we were here, we were talking about forgetting. And hey, quick reminder, I sent you a Zoom link for our review session. That'll be at 7 o'clock tonight. If you can't make it, I will record it and put it on YouTube later this evening so that everybody has an opportunity to see it, even if you can't make it tonight, okay? And maybe if you're lucky, you'll see Smedley or Earl or both. Okay, so the last time that we were here, we were talking about motivated forgetting. And I was talking a little bit about what is referred to as the memory war. So around the 1980s, something kind of interesting happened. So you started hearing a lot of stories about things related to satanic ritual abuse, particularly in daycare centers. And additionally, you would start to hear stories about people recovering memories of sexual abuse. So the idea basically being that these people had somehow, through the suggestions of a therapist or a hypnotist, they basically had repressed memories of early childhood abuse, and then they later remembered those events. And so the memory wars are basically, not really wars, but researchers basically firing back at each other to basically determine whether or not these recovered memories were real or fake. Now, let's be really clear. When we're talking about this, we have to have a few caveats. Abuse is real, abuse happens, and occasionally repression happens. However, if you're recovering a memory due to the influence of drugs or hypnotic suggestions or things like that, there is some data that suggests that it is less than reliable. So one of the things that I kind of wanted to tell you about related to these memory wars is the case of Elizabeth Loftus. So Elizabeth Loftus has done a lot of work on false memory research, which we are largely going to talk about next in the next couple of lectures, how eyewitness testimony can be modified. So Elizabeth Loftus did a lot of different research on the misinformation effect how memories can be changed and distorted. And she's often served as an expert witness on trials that do involve things like eyewitness memory. So just to be clear, she's been in the trial for O.J. Simpson, the trial of mass murderers Ted Bundy, the trial of Oliver North, the trial of the officers accused in the beating of Rodney King, the Menendez brothers, litigation involving Michael Jackson, Martha Stewart, Scooter Libby, the Duke University lacrosse team. All of these were pretty high profile cases in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s. So the memory wars basically happens, she starts shifting her work to looking at the implantation of false memories. So if you had me for general psych, you might have heard me talk about instances where people were presented with doctored videos or doctored journals or altered photographs that created false memories and implanted false memories. So based on this research, Loftus could basically look at, she could make somebody believe that they'd met Bugs Bunny at Disney World, which can't actually happen. She's had people recall false memories of getting lost in the mall and things like that. So she actually basically provided expert testimony in a case in 1990. And this was a case of somebody being accused of murder, but the only evidence against him was basically provided by his daughter, who basically said that she'd had a recovered memory of sexual assault by him. And so Loftus kind of gave evidence about the fact that memory is malleable, but she didn't know any of the research about the type of memory that this girl actually had. So she started doing a lot of work on this. And basically what ended up happening, a lot of people don't agree with the research. And in some cases, she has actually been sued, and she's been sued because of this work. And then finally, there's a famous Jane Doe case from 1997. And basically, she was at the University of Washington, and based on this case, she basically got sued as well as the University of Washington. And what did the University of Washington basically do? They dropped her. And they didn't really back her up. So she ended up going to UC Irvine, where she currently is today. But basically, I think Loftus's case, and I'm talking about it a while, just goes to show that when we talk about recovered memories of abuse, it's a really contentious issue. And this is not me saying that if you remember something from the past, that doesn't make it real. What I am saying is that memory is a lot more complicated than you either remember it or you don't. So here's what's actually kind of interesting. So they have actually, Clancy and colleagues gave different groups of abuse survivors the DRM paradigm, the Deese, Roediger, and McDermott paradigm. So for those who may not remember, the Deese, Roediger, and McDermott paradigm is basically, I give you a bunch of related words like honey, taste, good, sugar, soda, heart, chocolate. They're all related to a word, a critical lure that I never actually say. But a good percentage of people, about 40%, or rather about 40% of the time, when you give people a list of these words, they will recall the critical lure and falsely recognize having seen it when they never actually saw it. So what you're looking at here, based on the data from Clancy, are 4 different groups of people. So we have our control groups, people that have never been abused. We have our group of people who have always remembered their abuse. We have groups of people who do report being abused but don't recall it. And then we have another group of people who reported being abused and actually recovered those memories. And what we find is that if you look at the DRM paradigm, for controls, they tend to falsely recall or recognize about 40% of the time. And we've actually found that here at COTI. We did a replication study with the Gen Psych students, and we found that a little less than 40% of the time, they falsely recalled the lore. For people who always remember their abuse, recognition of the critical lore is higher. People who have abuse and don't recall the lore, we're kind of in like the 40s and the 50s range. But our group who has recovered memories of abuse, they have a significantly higher false recognition. And I don't necessarily know what that means. Does that mean that they were making information up? I don't think so. I don't necessarily believe that. What I do know is that odds are that this is partially happening because of how their memory networks are structured. Additionally, Leaf and Fatkowicz back in 1995, in the thick of the memory wars, basically reported that 80% of patients that are reporting recovered memories typically got that suggestion from their therapist. So the therapist might say something like, if you have a period in your life that you don't really remember very well, it's possible that abuse might have occurred and you basically blocked it out. And that could be true, but it may also not be true. And so I think it's really important to have a healthy skepticism, but not cynicism when we hear people report recovered memories. It does happen, but I would argue, based on what we know about memory and how it works, that it's probably the exception rather than the rule. So I want to go back to that study that I showed you last time. So I gave you a list of words, and then I basically told you when you were done learning that list that it was for practice and you wouldn't need to remember it later. And then what we tend to find, you did not show this, you actually had pretty good recall for both lists. What we do find for most people is that if I tell you that a list is just for practice and you don't need to remember it, what we tend to find is that people's memory for those materials, in fact, gets worse. This is a phenomenon referred to as directed forgetting. So basically, we have impaired long-term memory due to an instruction to forget. And interestingly enough, this is an older procedure than you would think. It was originally developed in the 1960s, which I think is pretty cool. Now, one of the other things that we can find, you can do this for individual items. You can also do what I did and do it for whole lists of items. So this works well both at the item level. So if I show you an item and then immediately after go, you can forget it. Or I show you another item and I go, well, you can remember that. We do tend to find that it works pretty well both for items and for lists. And what's interesting is that at least for the item method, this could be due to the fact that once I tell you, you don't need to remember that item, you may not encode it. For lists, what we may find instead is what is called retrieval inhibition. So I basically inhibit my ability to retrieve those items, and I focus more on retrieving the list I was told to remember. Interference can also play a role in this as well. Okay, here's where Dr. Gilchrist gets angry. I don't get angry about the memory wars, but I do get angry about this. So one of the things that we do know as well is that you can actually inhibit information that is already, you can inhibit information and thus make it harder to remember. So we're going to talk a little bit about what is referred to as the think, no, think paradigm from 2001. So here's where I get completely unbiased, or I get completely biased for a minute. So when I was in undergrad, I did an honors thesis. And an honors thesis was basically you develop your own project, and you collect the data, and then you defend it just the way that you would if you were presenting like a master's thesis or a doctoral thesis. So I got to do my own independent research project, and I wanted to look at this. And you know what? It's not a very big effect. And because it's not a very big effect, it is very, very hard to get. Unless you are the researcher or you've talked to the researcher. And I'm sorry, this is my opinion, and I'm getting really hard-lined. I kind of got irate a couple of years ago because I went to a conference, talked with somebody about this particular finding, and it was insinuated that I didn't get the original findings because I didn't give the right instructions. My opinion is, if it matters what kind of instructions you give people, it's probably not a very big effect and may in fact not be real. So yeah, I'm very biased here. So let me tell you a little bit about what's involved in the think, no, think paradigm. So the idea is I give you items. I either give you words, or in this case, I give you faces paired with a particular picture. So in the experimental phase, so I show you all of these items. And then in the experimental phase, I basically present you with a face. If it's outlined in this green outline, you need to think of the item that was associated with that face. So you would actually be told, think of this image that you saw previously. If it's outlined in red, you are not supposed to think about what came next. You are actively supposed to suppress it. And so what Anderson and Green originally found, they did this with word pairs. So in think, if I gave you the first word pair or word in the pair, you were supposed to think of the second. In the no think case, if I gave you the first word in a pair, you're supposed to not think of the second word in the pair. And what's really interesting is that Anderson and Green basically found that when you're told to suppress information, your memory for that item is worse than if you had not seen it at all, indicating suppression. However, I'm going to suggest that it's not a very big effect, because it isn't. And a lot of people who have failed to replicate this finding can't get published because we're not interested in publishing non-significant effects. So this makes me angry. And generally what we're going to find is that certain strategies vary in terms of the effectiveness of suppression. You need to actively inhibit, and we believe that to suppress requires executive control. And when we talk about executive control, that obviously relates to working memory capacity. So the better that your working memory capacity is, the better able you are to suppress and inhibit information, because you can control your attention better. Okay, rant over. I could rant about that all day long. My poor research method students have heard me talk about this at length. So now I want to talk a little bit about the role that context plays in being able to remember, and context can also play a role when we forget. So we have to talk a little bit about what is referred to as the encoding specificity principle. Generally, we do sometimes find that forgetting happens not because we didn't encode it well enough, but because we don't use the right triggers to help us remember. We don't use the right cues. So how many of you have had this happen? And you can jump on the chat, and if you're in class, raise your hand. How many of you have had the situation where there's something that you want to go get in another room, and you get up to go get it, you walk through the doorway, and then all of a sudden you don't remember why you came in there? How many of you have this happen to? Okay, so this is famously, oh, we got it on the chat. Yep, I do that all the time. Of course you do. This is famously referred to as the doorway problem. The idea is that when you are in a certain room and you're thinking, I need to go get the thing, and then you go out of the room to get the thing, all of a sudden, you're in a brand new environmental context. And everything that you try to remember is in a certain environmental context. Generally, we know that the more that your environment and encoding matches your environment at retrieval, the better your memory for it is going to be. So my answer to you, if you are suffering from the doorway problem, go back in the room you were in and then try again. Try to remember it and then go get it. So the encoding specificity principle is basically the idea that your retrieval ability or your ability to retrieve something well depends on the overlap between the information that's available at retrieval and the information that's available in the memory trace that you formed. So the more that your encoding and retrieval contexts match, the better your memory is going to be. So for example, and I think my research methods students have heard this story too. When I was in grad school, my very first year of grad level stats class, the final exam that we were supposed to take was actually going to be in a different classroom than where we had class and thus study the material. And this is a bad thing to do with a bunch of psychology graduate students. We basically tried to argue getting out of the final on the basis of the encoding specificity principle. We said, we studied in one room, we're getting tested in another. That's not fair, it's gonna hurt our grade. You need to not give us the final. That didn't work. I did fine, I got an A, I'm okay. So context matters. So one of the famous experiments that has been done with this was a researcher in context or in collaboration with Alan Badley, looking at the effect of environmental context on retrieval. So you have groups of scuba divers, and depending on the condition, they either study a list of words on land, or they study a list of words underwater. And then we switch up the retrieval conditions. They either recall the items on land or they recall the items underwater. So when you cross the study and the retrieval contexts, we've got 4 different conditions. We've got people who studied and were tested on land. We've got people who studied and were tested underwater. And then we've got people who studied on land and were tested underwater, and people who studied underwater and were tested on land. So what we generally tend to find is that the best performance occurs when the encoding and retrieval contexts match. So here's the people who learned words on land. Their performance is much better when they actually have to try to remember those items on land. Here are the people who learned words underwater. Their performance gets better when they are also tested underwater. So this is where some of those ideas for study tips that you sometimes hear about come from. Study in the same classroom where you're going to take your test. Have a certain flavor of gum in your mouth when you study, and make sure you have that same flavor in your mouth when you test. Same sort of idea. We want our encoding and retrieval contexts to match up as much as possible. Your learning context matters too. So we actually know that your performance is better when the cues at learning and recall match. So here, this is research by Thompson and Endeltelving in 1970. They were basically given either strong or weak input cues. So for example, a case of a strong cue would be white and black. They're very strongly associated with each other. Or they got train and black. So they either got weak input cues or strong input cues. And again, we find that when the cues match at learning and retrieval, again, performance tends to be better. So people that got weak input cues tended to do better when their output cues were also weak. People who got strong input cues tended to perform better when their output cues were also strong. So when the context, even in terms of learning, match what's happening at retrieval, performance tends to be better. Now, kind of related to this, it turns out that not only does our external environment matter, but our internal environment matters. So we have something called mood congruent memory. So mood congruent memory is basically the idea that when we're in a good mood, we're going to remember lots of happy memories. When we're in a bad mood, we're going to remember a lot of sad, unhappy memories. And this actually kind of relates to something that you should have read about in McRaney pretty recently, something called consistency bias. Based on how you are feeling right now, you will basically change your memory of the past to fit with how you're feeling now. We also have what's called state-dependent memory. So not only does this happen for our mood, this also happens based on whether or not we're under the influence. So researchers find, and I would not recommend testing this, like not at all. If you're drunk and you go put $10 somewhere, odds are pretty good you're not going to be able to find that in the morning when you've sobered up. However, research does suggest you'll probably have a pretty good chance of finding that money again if you're drunk. So I just want to be clear, don't study for the test drunk and don't take it drunk. Alcohol really messes with your memory abilities. So really, you shouldn't do that. But generally, we do tend to find that the state, if you're under the influence, when you study something, odds are pretty good you'll have slightly better performance if you are also under the influence when you are tested. That is all I am going to say. I don't want that practiced in real life, please. This is a dry campus. Okay, so we have to talk a little bit about the role of consolidation. So we've talked about how you get information from short-term into long-term memory. And we've talked about all of the different types of cognitive strategies that you can do to make that happen. One of the things that we haven't talked about that does also play a role in forgetting is what is known as consolidation. So once we form a new long-term memory, consolidation is the process of getting this information to move to the cerebral cortex, where it can basically be there forever. So remember our Ebbinghaus forgetting curve. So remember that the forgetting curve that I showed you last time is basically this, that most of your forgetting occurs within the first hour of having learned something, and then it levels off over time. So why does the greatest amount of forgetting tend to happen early on? And why is it that up to 30 days later, information stays at a low but stable level? It doesn't really drop off much more after that. This is because of a process known as consolidation. This is a process that does involve the brain, and it fixes information into long-term memory so that it can be there permanently. This is a process that can take several hours and up to days, and then even years. The hippocampus is really going to be critical for this, especially for episodic memories. So sometimes researchers have actually looked at this by looking at people who have head injuries. So I believe some researchers followed up with boxers and American football players, and they'd basically wait on the sidelines anytime that somebody got hit in the head. And they would immediately ask the people right after their concussion, what were you trying to do? What was the play that you were trying to execute? And at least initially, they'd be able to tell you. If you ask them a few minutes later, though, they wouldn't be able to, and that's because damage to the brain like that does disrupt this consolidation process. Okay, so there are two different phases of consolidation. So first of all, we get this rapid initial storage in the hippocampus. Now, this is true for a lot of different types of memories, but after the hippocampus, the second phase occurs for our explicit or declarative memories, so our episodic and semantic memories. We transfer that information from the hippocampus all the way into the cerebral cortex. So basically, when you form a memory, if it's something that you will need to remember for later, especially if it's declarative, there's going to be this very slow process of the actual physical trace migrating from the hippocampus all the way up into the cerebral cortex. And again, this may explain something like Jost's law, the idea that older memories are more resistant to forgetting than younger memories. Older memories have completed that consolidation process, younger memories have not. And this is a process that can take days or even years. So what evidence do we have for consolidation? Well, we have a couple of things. So first of all, we do have the forgetting curve, which we've already talked about. One of the other things that we know is that newer memories are more susceptible to retroactive interference. So that RI stands for retroactive interference, not Rhode Island. So newer memories are a lot more susceptible to that backward acting interference, but only for dissimilar materials, which is actually kind of interesting. One of the other big pieces of evidence that we have is alcoholic blackout. So the reason that blackouts occur when you drink too much alcohol is because you have basically drunk so much alcohol that the depressant effects actually cause the hippocampus to shut down, temporarily, of course. So what ends up happening is that if you drink so much that the hippocampus can no longer consolidate information. So that's why it is very unlikely that after a blackout that you will be able to remember what happened before. But what's interesting is that memories that you formed before you were drinking tend to be better remembered because the hippocampus hadn't shut down at that point and some consolidation could happen. Additionally, when we look at neuroimaging, we do find that newer memories, more recent memories, are more likely to activate the hippocampus. Older memories tend to activate cortical areas instead. Again, showing that older memories are basically stored in the cerebral cortex and distributed in the cerebral cortex, which I think is pretty cool. It also explains why with Alzheimer's disease, what you typically tend to see is that once long-term memory loss starts to happen, younger memories go first, older memories come later. And that's because the atrophy starts with the hippocampus and then it radiates out toward the neocortex. All right, everybody good? Does anybody need more time? Okay. So now we got to talk briefly about amnesia. I'm going to try to keep it short. I am going to record a video for you about semantic memory. It will not be on exam 2, but it will probably be on your third exam. So I will record that for you so that we have time to tell our ghost story on Wednesday. Okay, so really quick, and you can hop on the chat. What do you know about amnesia if you only had to use books, TV, and movies as your source? So go ahead and write down a few things that you know about amnesia based on that. And if you are on Zoom, you can drop in the chat your ideas. What do you know about amnesia? All right, so would somebody like to share what they learned about amnesia from movies? Amnesia is forgetting memories that are defining for you to be you, like your name or past memories. How many of you wrote down or also thought of the fact that amnesia in TV and movies is basically losing your whole identity? You're like, who am I? I think I saw a really bad Star Trek episode where Kirk got amnesia and he just walked around like, who am I? What is my name? Amnesia doesn't work that way most of the time. How does amnesia often happen? If we went by TV and cartoons and movies and books. Usually head trauma. Now I'm going to get a little silly. Based on what we know about amnesia from TV and books, how do we fix it? We hit them in the head again. This is the part where I very helpfully remind you that contrary to what you see in cartoons like Disney cartoons and Looney Tunes and Tom and Jerry, if somebody has amnesia due to brain damage, hitting them in the head is not going to fix that brain damage. Remember, brain damage plus brain damage does not equal cure. Brain damage plus brain damage equals more brain damage. So if your friend is struggling with a head injury, please don't hit them in the head. One would think that was common sense. So what is amnesia? Amnesia is basically permanent impairment to some part of the memory system. Now, here's what it often tends to look like when we watch it on TV. In pop culture, let's be clear what amnesia is not. Pop culture basically has all memory being forgotten. And in a couple of instances, it's a complete personality change. So for example, one of my favorite things to show, and I might show it before class next time, there's a Donald Duck cartoon that I grew up with where Donald gets hit on the head with a flower pot. And he basically forgets Daisy, his girlfriend, but he all of a sudden doesn't have that kind of voice. He has a beautiful singing voice and everybody loves him. So all memories forgotten. There's a complete personality change. I saw an old Tom and Jerry cartoon where Tom got hit in the head and thought he was a mouse. The problem is created and often cured by another hit on the head, or in certain cases, it is caused by a traumatic experience. Now, that is a form of dissociative amnesia. That is a psychological issue. Most of the amnesia that we're going to be talking about here is specifically due to brain damage. So this is not what amnesia actually is. Now, I would say there are a couple of movies that get it right. Memory researchers enjoy the portrayal in the movie Memento. They also actually say that the portrayal in Finding Nemo with Dory is pretty close, minus the whole suddenly remembering P. Sherman Wallaby Way. Like, That wouldn't happen if you had that kind of amnesia. 51st dates comes pretty close. The only problem is that with certain types of amnesia, your memory doesn't reset at the end of every day. Rather, it resets maybe every 15 seconds. It's like constantly being in the present moment. So there are two main types. So we have what's called retrograde amnesia. These people are unable to remember details learned prior to their amnesia. So a good friend of mine who was in my lab when I was in graduate school, for a couple of years, she dated a man who was a quadriplegic. And part of the reason that he was quadriplegic was because a truck that he had been driving when he was in high school had been hit by a train. Now, obviously, that's a lot of trauma. That's a lot of brain and spinal cord injury. And it turns out that when you're in that kind of situation, you may experience a little bit of retrograde amnesia. He cannot remember the entire day prior to the accident. Now, likewise, I was in a really bad car accident when I was 18. I got hit by two cars that were going about 60 miles an hour and they T-boned me. And I was okay, but I generally did not remember exactly why I made the mistake that I made that got me in that car accident in the first place. So that's usually because of something like damage consolidation. And I didn't have a concussion, but whiplash is absolutely a thing and you need to be careful. But the main type of amnesia that we tend to talk about is what's called anterograde amnesia. These people are unable to form new explicit memories, new long-term memories. Probably the best known case is the case of Henry Molaison, or HM. He damaged, his hippocampus was basically damaged in both lobes to deal with intractable epilepsy. And it turned out that removing those parts of his temporal lobe did actually reduce his epilepsy symptoms. But the problem was he could not form new explicit memories. So the issue is converting short-term into long-term. So if you look at somebody that has amnesia and you give them a list of items to remember, here's what we're going to find with people that have anterograde amnesia. So on my y-axis, I'm going to have recall. And then on my x-axis, I'm going to have the position in list. So we're going to look at a little bit of the serial position effect. So generally, when I give the average person lists of items to remember, we tend to find that people remember the first items in a list really well, and they remember the last items of the list really well. So they have a primacy effect that is due to rehearsing the items and getting them in long-term memory. And then we have a recency effect, which is due to a short-term memory component. Now, somebody who has anterograde amnesia cannot convert short-term into long-term memory. So if I look at somebody who, so I'll put that this is a control. So if I look at somebody who has anterograde amnesia, they will have no primacy, but they will absolutely still have recency because that's a short-term memory component. So these are my amnesics. So anything that was formed prior to HM surgery, he was able to remember, but he couldn't form new memories. So he was never able to remember who the current president of the United States actually was. He could never update that. So here's kind of what a normal human brain looks like, and here's HM's brain. So here you can kind of see our medial temporal lobes. They're toward the center, and this is what it looks like with you. And if we were kind of looking at a coronal view, here are the hippocampi in each lobe, in each hemisphere. Here's HM's brain, so they basically removed these portions of the temporal lobe, and you can see that the hippocampus in both hemispheres is completely gone. So here's what's really important. HM could learn new things, and amnesics can learn new things. But we have to make a distinction between explicit memory, like memories for events and memories for facts, versus implicit memories like skills or classical conditioning. So what you're looking at here, if you've ever been into my office, you've probably seen a puzzle that looks like this. This is called the Tower of Hanoi, sometimes referred to as the Tower of London. And basically what you're supposed to do is you move this whole set of discs over to the final peg. But here's the catch. You can only move one disc at a time, and you can never put a larger disc on top of a smaller disc. So you're constantly having to move back and forth between these pegs until you've moved all of these items over to C. You give this to HM repeatedly, he gets better at the task, he answers it more quickly, and he makes less mistakes, showing that he's actually learned something. But if you ask him, hey, have you ever done this before? What's he going to tell you? No. The memory of actually doing the puzzle is an episodic memory. Solving the puzzle itself is a procedural or implicit memory. So HM could learn new things, but they're going to be implicit memory rather than explicit. And you can even see here that he is capable of even remembering and drawing out the spatial layout of his house. So amnesia doesn't necessarily mean you can't learn new things. We just have to be very critical on what those things are. So he could remember explicit memory from before the surgery, but could not form new explicit memories. All right, everybody good? Okay. So that's all I had for forgetting. I am going to load up our discussion of semantic memory. I'm not going to present all of it. I wouldn't do that to you, but maybe about 20 minutes or so. And we will have an activity where you can draw actually, for those of you that are going to Zoom in on Wednesday, do me a favor. Draw me a picture of a dog and take a picture of it and email it to me. And those of you that are going to be here in class on Wednesday, go ahead and just be prepared to draw a dog on the chalkboard as soon as you come to class on Wednesday, okay? We're going to draw some dogs, people. So that is all I have for you today. I hope you have a wonderful day, and I will see you all on Wednesday. See you tonight for the review session at 7 o'clock.